Welcome everyone. This is the January Zeal call, the first Zeal call of 2021, and we are joined by Danny O'Brien, Chief Strategy Officer, I believe, at Electronic Frontier Foundation. I have your full bio in the deck, but welcome and thanks for joining us. And then, without further ado, let's kick it off. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda today. Mainly, I want to save as much time as possible for our conversation with Danny. But since this is a Zcash community call, it's worth starting out with a warm welcome and some general housekeeping announcements, just in case it's been a minute since you've been in the forums, or if you want to catch up on the latest and greatest Zcash stuff, that's what the announcements are for. I have 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, but really this is a conversation. It's meant to be engaging. So any questions you have, feel free to throw them in the chat as we're talking, or you can use the little Q&A section that's built into the conference tool that we're using. So let's kick off with some announcements. First and foremost, this is a very housekeeping oriented announcement. ECC and Zcash Foundation are hiring. There's never been a better time to join the Zcash community, and you can get paid for it. So I believe Zcash Foundation is hiring a cryptographer, and Electric Coin Company is hiring for a senior DevOps role, and then a developer relations and documentation lead. So if that's interesting to you, I'm happy to share a link in the comments as we're talking, or a link in the chat as we're talking. Zcash OMG, Zcash Open Major Grants, is up and running. They're issuing grants. They actually issued their first 3 grants last week, and they're meeting regularly. So if it's been a minute since you've checked that out, they do post all of their meeting summaries in the forum, and you can check out that link that I have here. And then lastly, Zeal call, these community calls, is just one of 3 regular monthly calls that we host. We also have a gardening club, which is a developer focused call where open source projects grow. That's the gardening botany theme that we love so much at Zcash. That's next week, February 9th. Actually, that's in 2 weeks. I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's in 2 weeks, February 9th. And then we also have the Arborist call, which is a more protocol-focused discussion. Both of those calls will be talking about the upcoming network upgrade, and particularly ZIP 224. Other features might be discussed, but I know ZIP 224 is on the agenda for both of those. So if that's not a familiar term to you, or if you're kind of curious as to what that is, definitely join those conversations and or check out the Electric Coin Company and the Zcash Foundation blogs for the latest and greatest on that. Okay, and now to the meat and potatoes, to the main event. So Danny is joining us from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm going to give him a little intro, a little bio, but then Danny, if you have anything to add, or if I missed anything, please correct me. I took this from the website, so I hope it's accurate. So Danny O'Brien has been an activist online for online free speech and privacy for over 20 years. He must have started when he was like 3. And he helped found the Open Rights Group in Britain. He joined EFF in 2005, and he now supervises EFF's medium to long-term strategy. So we'll hear a little bit about that as we get the conversation going. And he has an eye for maintaining the organization's global impact and reputation. That's something that if you check out EFF's website is readily apparent. They are not just focused in the Western world, in the United States or Europe. Their applications of fighting for digital rights really span across countries, across hemispheres. So it's such an incredible organization, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Another interesting thing I liked, or I discovered about Danny, is that he coined the term life hack, which That's a very envious claim to fame. If you have that domain, if you were able to register lifehack.com, you're probably sitting on a very valuable domain. And for people who aren't familiar with EFF, just a little bit of background. It's a leading nonprofit, probably one of the world's leading nonprofits, defending civil liberties in the digital world. It was founded in 1990. They focus mostly on legal advocacy, but there's, of course, some other work that they do that Danny can tell us about. And they champion specifically user privacy, freedom of expression, and innovation. So what did I miss, Danny? I know I covered a lot of ground, but
you covered the embarrassing life hacks confession. I think that's probably the main thing to touch on. Yeah, if I had a dollar for every time life hack was mentioned after I coined it, then I would probably have a very different idea of intellectual property than I actually do. So
yes, we will talk about intellectual property today.
yeah, happy to. I mean, I think the way that this is going to go, and thank you very much for that introduction, is that if anybody does have any questions, I'm going to take us on a bit of a roller coaster tour, both of sort of the where we've got to so far, but also present day stuff. EFF is pretty heavily involved in um, specifically cryptocurrency issues, but also how it pertains to sort of civil liberties in general. So if you have any questions, don't wait until the 10 minutes at the end. Feel free to chip in, and I'll keep an eye on it and try not to be too distracted. I'm wearing my 30 years of the EFF t-shirt, and I think one of the things that I try and convey in conversations like this is that there is a history. I think it's really interesting how quickly we can go from thinking something is really novel and exciting to realizing that we have a decade of being really novel and exciting. Uh, this latest wave, and I do think of it as a wave of recognition of the power of cryptocurrency and the sort of mathematical technologies around it. I guess that must have started in 2009. Is it 2009 that the Satoshi paper came out?
Yeah,
Yeah,
2008,
so
and then it launched in 2009.
yeah, right. So I mean that's over a decade now. So there's a history there, right? Like it's not old, but it's not new either. Um, and EFF's history with this bundle of concepts, right, has gone back, I think, since it's almost to our founding. And in fact, there's a personal element to this too. I was just thinking about this as we were starting, in that I actually met Zuko. Um, we were both 3 years old at the time. In one of the what turned out to be one of the last cypherpunks physical meetings. So the cypherpunks, which were these core of activist coders in the late 20th and early 21st century, uh, uh, met online. There was of course the mailing lists. One of the spin-off mailing lists was the mailing list that Satoshi sent his paper to, and there was a relatively small group of people who were interested in this topic at the time, but they also had physical meetings in the Bay Area, and I just come to the Bay Area, and I actually met with, there was a small posse of us that would go to the physical meetings, and that included Zuko, Bram Cohen, who was to later create BitTorrent, and quite a few others who were thinking in this area. And in fact, the first meeting I think I went to had a discussion very similar to this with Cindy Cohen, who was then the legal director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and had just come from her victory in the legal case, which really set one of the pillars of this whole movement that enabled it, which is up until that moment, actually the strong encryption, public key cryptography was something that the government US government was trying to regulate the control of. And the way that they were doing that was preventing the export of essentially the algorithm itself, software that was written on that algorithm. And for those of you who know your ancient history, this is the reason why Pretty Good Privacy, PGP, got some early notoriety, because the US government began investigating its author, Phil Zimmerman. It was a freeware program at the time, for permitting it to be exported. So there were actual controls, or attempted controls, on the very idea of giving someone else some code that could be used in certain ways.
And that case was Bernstein versus DOJ?
Yeah, that's Bernstein
Yeah.
versus DOJ. So, of course, like any legal case, that dragged out for some time, but the core of the 90s fight was this idea that you really both couldn't and shouldn't, as a government, place controls on expression, expressive speech, and that code itself was expressive speech. And the reason why I start with this is because one of the things that I think is always important to unwrap, both to understand where you are and where the future is going to be, is to what your preconceptions are. And I think we assume now, hey, if I write some software, I can put it out there to the rest of the world and they will be able to use it. Or I will be able to kind of partake in a network like the Zcash blockchain, or other software like that. And you can run it, you can use it, you can share it. And that was a contingent truth, right? That was something that was not assured for several years, to the extent that in the late 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, at the very beginnings of the internet, there was a fairly concerted attempt by some powerful actors and lobbyists to bend the technology to conform with their idea of the future, which is to say, right up until the mid 2000s, there were serious attempts in the US at least, to demand that technology, internet technology, computing technology, include features that would either filter and block illicit content, which is to say content that might be copyright infringing, and to prevent the transmission or the use of really fundamental tools like strong encryption. And when I talk about strong encryption, I mean public key encryption, but also, of course, all the technologies that are connected to that. For instance, being able to do authentication through signatures, and the like. At this time, with the cypherpunks, I think it was really only that community that recognized the potential for all of these things. I think people still to this day think of that array of algorithms essentially as something that just protects people's privacy and the security of their communications. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I wanted to look at the specific language from one of the cases that happened almost immediately after Cindy Cohen's case, Bernstein versus DOJ. And this, I believe, was in California. And Judge Patel in this case said the court finds no meaningful difference between a computer language and a language like German or French. So like music and mathematical equations, computer language is just that, a language. It communicates information either to a computer or to those who can read it. So like you were saying, Danny, this issue has kind of come up in waves, and every single wave introduces a new set of questions, a new set of applications, especially given that the internet has grown in ubiquity, right? In 1995, mobile phones were not internet enabled in the way that they are today. And certainly the internet has not been almost like, what's the word that I'm looking for, infrastructurally enabled or connected to buildings or cities in the way that you see it today, that it enables things like widespread surveillance programs. So I think that's a good place to start. Some of the questions that come up for me are like now around who can read computer languages or who has access to this specific protected type of speech, but that might be a conversation for another day. I think I pulled out some 5 examples of different ways that code of speech has cropped up in EFF's work. And I think the audience is also mentioning a few examples that they want to talk about. So I wonder how you want to take this. Like, we can throw out a topic, spend 5 minutes or so kind of talking about it back and forth. I feel like the nuance really helps people understand the difference between code as speech, like specifically referring to an algorithm or a tech platform, and something that's a little bit more like content as speech. So when content gets moderated or when somebody gets deplatformed, do we think about that as an infringement on code of speech? I personally think about it more as a straight up speech. And then when you look at something like algorithmic bias or facial recognition, banning that does raise some interesting questions for the extent to which we want to defend code of speech. So yeah, where do you want to start?
Well, I think that the important thing to recognize with that idea of code being speech, which you quoted so brilliantly, right? Which was a thing that we really had to argue for, because here was this strange new mumbo jumbo coming into the courts, and the reason why we did it is because speech has protections. There are protections under the US Constitution. There are protections under international human rights instruments. And that doesn't mean that you can't have laws about speech. It just means that those laws have to pass some degree of scrutiny for them to be legitimate laws. And what that means is that the presumption is that you can communicate, you can share, and that any law kind of restricting that will is open to challenge. What this means is that, for instance, when you're creating software or when you're sharing software, the presumption is that you're acting to share the expression of your thoughts, rather than kind of importing or exporting an armament, which is sort of how the alternative viewpoint that was happening in the 90s. And I think it's interesting to sort of separate the sort of other restrictions on internet speech that we also saw then and going forward, because I think that begins to show exactly what kind of constraints you might have within the law, and also what kind of constraints that you might have if you are a group that doesn't really care that much about international human rights or constitutional challenges. So on one hand, you have laws that were sort of fit into the traditional pattern of speech laws, and in particular copyright, intellectual property. So there is hundreds of years of intellectual property law. There was a fairly concerted attempt again to actually expand that as we went into the digital world, in the same way as the law enforcement will say, oh my goodness, there's so much encryption going on here. There's so much dark money moving around. We need new powers to monitor and control that. So the first echoes of that were in the intellectual property industries, who said, actually, we need a more drastic ability to take down and remove content on the internet compared to what we could do in the pre-digital world. So that's stuff like, the DMCA, right? The DMCA gives copyright holders the ability to take down a book, an encyclopedia, an entire website more quickly than they were ever able to do, than anyone was ever able to do pre the internet. And then you have kind of the other side of that, which is when people want to constrict or limit speech outside the legal system. And I guess there's two parts to that, just to go into this fractal tree of subsections.
I'm trying to keep it all in here because I have a follow-up question.
And I mean, I should say, and I usually preface the whole thing by saying I'm not actually a lawyer, and I'm certainly not your lawyer, so none of this is legal advice. But yes, fortunately, we're working at a level here where if you took this as legal advice, it would be like trying to take the Cliff's Notes into court. But the two parts of what you see in this sort of non-legal enforcement of controls goes from I guess what we traditionally see as censorship online, which is states targeting individuals or blocking at the border, at the Great Firewall of China being one, the Arab Spring aftermath. We've just written a really good article talking about what we did, again, 10 years ago, to try and get information out of Tunisia at that time. And then you have this other part of it, which is what companies do, centralized companies do, to control speech on their platforms. And that's not, a First Amendment issue, but it can become an issue of expression and control. And the example I would pick that concerns me a lot in the sort of cryptocurrency and more broadly this space is platforms like Apple and to a lesser extent Android, who are able to control what code of speech you get to express on your device by excluding things from the Apple App Store and locking down your device, so it's like someone else is speaking for you or checking what you can say before you even say it.
Or backdoors. Okay, let me try to summarize kind of the past 10 minutes or so we can get on the same page, and if people have questions they can jump in. So the first kind of 1995 wave of code of speech really took something like encryption out of the military weapons arms classification and put it into the protected class of speech. And that was a huge kind of reframing and a huge legal reframing, you could think of it, and then allowed this whole class of strong privacy protecting encryption services to be available to citizens for multiple uses. And then we've seen how in the past 20 years or so, that's really taken root, 20 or more years. So that was like the first wave. And then the second wave, I think, that you mentioned is kind of like what I think of the Napster era. I was coming of age at that time, where, people wanted access, or people wanted to share creative content that they owned. If I go to a CD store and I buy a CD, I should be able to lend it to my friend or give it to my friend. And the challenge there was this inability to create something digital that was scarce. It's interesting how that is one of the core innovations that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies bring about, which is the ability to establish digital scarcity. So that was how IP kind of became a forcing function for corporations to maybe restrict code of speech or to establish legal precedents around copyright and the extent to which that applies to speech. I think is really fascinating. And now we're in the kind of third wave that you were just mentioning, which is taking all of this stuff out of the government and legal realm and putting it squarely in the like terms of conditions wasteland that we have between like us and our corporate tech lords. The examples that I have here kind of like touch on a few of them, so maybe we can go one by one, or kind of bucket them and talk about a few different things. So in the first one you mentioned copyright. I was surprised to learn that TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this was like in 2012, had all of these provisions for extending copyright protections to like from 50 years, which is what the standard is in the United States, to 170 years. And that really goes in contrast to a lot of the way media and information is shared online, which is not a lot of protections, a lot of ability to open source and copy and share and replicate things, as long as it's not for profit. So that I think is like one interesting case. I think for the jumping around a little bit, but for the middle one that you mentioned of or when you last mentioned like corporations now playing a more enforcement role, this came up in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, where governments are starting to work with tech platforms to completely turn off services altogether. This happened in Tunisia, this happened in Uganda recently, and it certainly happens around the world. But even in the United States, I think something that makes people a little bit uncomfortable was an application like Parler, which is I guess we could call it like a Twitter with a lot looser content moderation guidelines. But it was deplatformed from all the way through the stack up to AWS that took them offline. So that's kind of like a summary of how some of these examples play into that. One of the questions that one of the things that I found fascinating was EFF's position on the private use of facial recognition. So when I think of code of speech, I think of specifically like something like a facial recognition algorithm that can be used by the state or by government to surveil mass populations, versus I hadn't considered the independent use of facial recognition to, monitor police brutality at protests, or to just simply unlock your iPhone. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then we can switch over to how this all applies to cryptocurrency and specifically anonymity.
I was like mentally thinking, okay, well, this is great. We've covered so many spaces, but like, how do I bring it all back to?
We got to bring it down. Yes, exactly.
But it does, trust me, it does all fit together. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that once you have this idea in your head that the software that you use and you create and you share has these speech elements to it, I think a lot of stuff becomes both kind of outrageous, right? Like, I think that sometimes folks who are early adopters of technologies like Zcash or the internet or whatever the cutting edge digital technology is, develop a kind of instinct for what is bluntly right or wrong. They have a sense that people who haven't used that technology don't necessarily have, of what the limits of legal enforcement are and the directions that they should go in. I think that a lot of people who use the internet in their lives, I was going to say who are extremely online, but I think we all use the internet to a certain extent, have a sense of like concern when you see something like the Great Firewall of China. It just strikes them as profoundly odd to have someone else controlling what you can see and do to that extent. And I think that thing also kicks in when you see services, even services that, you know, the majority of people would view as offensive or even dangerous, are just taken completely offline without a vote being held or like any kind of like control or feedback to that act. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that because we have a very centralized internet currently, there's now this power being exercised in the land, and people feel that there need to be some constraints on that. I think the other thing to note, Ro, is that uh, we create that environment, or technologists create that environment. And one of the reasons why we instinctively have this idea of, as you said, being able to share and express what you want, without really having to beg permission of someone else before you do it, that's something that's been created by the technology. And I would suggest that a lot of the outer features, the features that people come to Zcash to use, and cryptocurrency more generally, you know, emerge from the math, emerge from the software that you're creating. These are new capabilities, and some of them we don't have a good ethical or legal framework to connect them to the rest of our life, but some of them we really do. And the one I would like pinpoint to try and like segue neatly is financial privacy, right?
Yeah.
In the financial privacy, if you're coming from the traditional financial sector, you kind of assume financial privacy is kind of a dead deal in some ways, or at least I've met many people who feel that way, right? Because they are so regulated, and the point when you're dealing with very large amounts of money is to for governments to be able to look into this entire system. If you're coming to this from two different places, right? If you're coming to this as just an ordinary person who uses cash and pays with credit cards, you're like, no, like this is really strange to have someone suddenly apply this entire banking system on every moment of my financial life. And the second part of it is people who come to it from being online, from understanding this technology, this software and its capabilities, and going, you know, that is not the default. And if you try and make that the default, in the same way as rights holders in the 90s were like, we need to re-engineer this internet so that copyright infringement cannot happen, or the NSA and others in the US government was like, we've got to build a system so that you can't say to a foreigner these string of symbols, because then they will learn about strong encryption. If you want to create the environment that reflects that legal or ethical view of the world, you're going to end up both completely destroying the golden goose, right? Completely re-engineering something in the pursuit of your particular view of how this should work, and alienating, stopping, killing in its tracks a completely broad and amazing potential future that is far more connected to how civil liberties are developing and human rights are developing and how people actually live.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. So that's such a good segue. It inspired a few thoughts for me, and I'll try to touch on them really quickly, and then we'll pivot over to specific crypto-related applications of code as speech. So one thing that I think is flawed with the metaphor code as speech, and I put this quote from Judge Patel up again, is because generally with spoken language like French or German or English or Spanish, especially in modern times, if you can read it, there's a pretty big assumption that you can also write it, right? So the people who are speaking are also participating in the listening process and the consumption process. That's not the case so much with code. It might be in the future though, but with code, there's a very few select special group of people who can quote unquote speak code. And those are the programmers, the developers, the researchers, the cryptographers, the encryption experts, like that's that group of people. And then you have all the people who consume code. And so code as speech, I think is, while it is a beautiful and powerful concept, it's limited in that people assume it applies to them when they may or may not be the people speaking code. And so like, you know, what are your rights for code as speech if you didn't create the algorithm, or if you are a passive user of a platform like Apple, like Facebook? Those companies, those for-profit corporations will quickly point out, you know, you agree to the terms and conditions, you're not forced to use this. And so I think that's what's creating a very palpable friction in this third wave of code as speech issues. And why is it such a good segue to crypto and financial services? Because money in that way works more similarly to code than it does to language, in that I use money every day, but I don't issue money. I'm not a banker. I'm not a government. I'm not a money printer. But I have rights to my money, and I have rights over this very powerful tool that lets me engage meaningfully with society. So when we spoke on Friday in preparation for this call, Danny, you said two things that I thought really set us up perfectly for talking about code as speech specific to Zcash. It's not enough for the technology to be resilient. The social and legal frameworks that uphold them also need to be robust, right? So it's not enough for us to invent uncensorable or censorship resistant, rather, fully encrypted code if it's not usable to people all around the world, and if it's not protected for people to use, then I think it still is a brittle system, especially given the select few people who have access to this technology. And then when you were talking about the regulatory environment, you said it, push hasn't come to shove quite yet. So let me move over here and talk about anonymous speech. We can talk about financial privacy in particular, and then you had mentioned a few examples, not just in the United States, but also in places like Brazil. And then Dara mentioned regarding remittances as a good example of, you know, your right to privacy. Maybe money as speech could be the way we term this section. Okay, and then I see that some people in the chat have been sharing resources to Coin Center. Just like EFF, Coin Center produces a lot of really great content and resources around how to think about emerging technologies like cryptocurrencies in current kind of regulatory frameworks. So yeah, take it away, Danny. Now we're on anonymous speech, cryptocurrencies, and like the long-term strategy that you see for this space.
So I think what happens is that sometimes you have like straight out attempts to create control of what people do that, you know, basically walk all over any kind of existing human rights definition. And let's put those in one box, right? That's situations where actually technologies can be very powerful in protecting rights because they're really kind of the only thing left. But then you get situations, and we've sort of described this all through this conversation, of where states kind of stumble into areas where they don't quite get the ramifications of what they're doing, or maybe they do and don't care, but they're embarking on a road which is going to end up with a really much less free environment for for their citizens. So the example I think that cropped up in the chat is a raft of really disturbing laws that began in the UK with the Investigatory Powers Act, and then more recently in Australia with a law who I can never, it's got two A's in it. It's like access and something I can never remember which way around they are, but which is bizarre because I spent almost a year working to try and stop it. And what is key about these laws is they basically go, okay, encryption is unbreakable. And also there's this whole pattern of other things that we want to stop in this mysterious software world. So what we will do is we will create a new government power, a new state power, where we can go to the companies that you've described, like Apple, right down actually to individual programmers, and compel them to rewrite their code, right? So you just sit there and you go, okay, our encryption protects the security of the communications, or Zcash protects the privacy of people's financial transactions if they choose. We'll just go to the people who write that code and tell them to put in, if A equals government, then send government private key.
All the
And
info.
right. And from a government point of view, that's it. That's problem solved, right? Like if we need that power, we've just made the mathematics go away, right? We've turned it to our own uses. From a free speech access, right? From the lens that the EFF looks at these things through, and the cypherpunks before us, and you know, that's a really dreadful, pervasive, ubiquitous act of the worst level of government interference in people's ability to express. And I push back a little bit from your framing of like, there are just some people who can use code to express themselves. Steve Jobs used the old Steve Jobs line of like, you know, computers are bicycles for the mind. One of the things that technology and software does is it empowers people to express themselves in new and different ways. And you don't need to build the bicycle to have that power. You just need to own one. So there's a lot of speech out there. There are a lot of acts out there that people are only able to do because they were able to share or use the ideas that others have given to them. You know, expression free speech is a conversation. You have a human rights right to both express and receive speech of your choosing. And so if something interferes with that baseline ability, we start getting into really, really deep waters very quickly. And I think that's the general concern. These new raft of laws really both don't place any effective limits on what the government can tell coders and others to stick into this software. They're secret. You can't tell someone if your software is violated in this way. And they're poorly understood, right? That both in UK and Australia, they created and granted themselves this huge power, and then realized, how we going to use this? And I don't think people realize to the extent to which we view, especially in the United States, we view governments with a lot of suspicion. But if you have a reasonably democratic or open government, um, you know, they know when somebody has handed them the one ring, right? Like they can see that this is a precipitous change, and as administrators, they worry that they're going to get into trouble. And so what we see is this amazing power being granted to these countries. These countries not actually exercising this power. Of course, we don't really know, but from all we can see and the whistleblowers that we would listen to, they haven't gone to WhatsApp and put a backdoor on it. I mean, don't hold me to that, but that's the
Yeah.
way it looks. And one of the reasons why it looks is because both sides know that if they did that, people might well, either people will freak in a democratic society, or people would be drawn into a power battle that that normal democratic actors really don't want to be in.
And both sides in this case are the government and the technology platforms that would facilitate this backdoor. Not
So,
both sides wouldn't be like the user and the platform, or the citizen and the government.
again, to bring something closer to home, right? You know, in theory, these companies could go to the Zcash developers and say, or if they're in Australia or the UK, although you can reach out and make threats in other places, and say, here is an order that you have to comply with, or you're going to go to jail. And playing this through, I don't think anybody involved in the development of these tools or Bitcoin or wherever we want to do is going to do that willingly or without a fight. And if you are asked to do that, please give EFF a call, because we would like to be your lawyers in that fight. And also, like, if these organizations say no, what's the government's next step? Are they going to literally bust them and take them down? Maybe. I mean, you know, governments do violent things all the time, but they would recognize that that would be crossing an incredible line. And I don't think they necessarily realize that until they do it. We saw in the FBI versus Apple case, right? That the FBI thought they were onto like a really easy win, because this was a terrorist who was California, attacked folks in California, home of Apple. Apple, like many tech companies, was very targeted.
Cooperative.
No, so at the time,
well,
you know,
they ended up not being, but previously had been cooperative with law
to a
enforcement
certain
requests.
degree, right? Like, you know, they it's not like they were like the worst enemies of law enforcement. And also, you know, all of these tech companies are facing a lot of criticism now. So the last thing they kind of want to be is like headlines saying Apple resists access to, you know,
terrorist
terrorists.
phone.
But as it turned out, Apple said no, fought it in the courts, and the popularity of the FBI's position was not straightforward. It was about 50-50. I remember the polls. And that was the same thing, right? This was the FBI saying, we don't only want to be able to reach, you know, get the physical phone, we want you to rewrite the software so that we can get access to it.
Always and forever, in perpetuity.
Well, so it wasn't a case of, I mean, just to be specific, it wasn't a case of like rewriting all Apple software. It was about creating a new version of the operating system that had this feature, and then burning it into this particular phone, and then suddenly magically that phone becomes like the
I use like a breakable phone.
An evidence, and like if you can compel a tech company to rewrite software at will, then I mean, my phone is a phone only by due of the software that runs in it. It's actually, you know, without that, it's a bunch of incredibly invasive sensors, right? It's like a camera and a microphone, like a barometer, whatever. And so if you give governments the power to say, okay, make that this other thing, then everything around you is completely fluid and not your friend anymore. So that's an incredible power that it's easy to write into a law, but it's very hard to execute on, right? Unless you're an autocrat.
In the court of public opinion, for sure.
Right.
Questions.
Sorry.
This hour flew by. I cannot believe it's 5 till. I promised Zuko that I would ask you a little bit about Zcash specifically. He said that you've played with the technology, you've used the wallet. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what your experience has been like. And then if we can end on some like maybe future challenges for how EFF, like what your long-term strategy is and any ways in which Zcash is related to that roadmap.
Sure. So
And Zuko says in the chat, just to put you totally on the spot, your friend from childhood, exercise your freedom of speech by posting to Zec board right now, Danny.
I will do it. Zuko is such a good, like if anybody was going to teach me to ride a bicycle, that would be, it would be Zuko. So of course I've played with Zcash and similar technologies right from their very beginnings, and you know, I am the director of long-term strategy at EFF, and you know, one of those things is being able to, one of those skills you try and develop is to be able to see something in its earliest moments and kind of try and extrapolate like what the effect of that was going to be. The cypherpunks in the 90s, you know, were dealing with 90s technology, and yet they were able to envisage not just the existence of cryptocurrency, but many of the legal and ethical issues it was going to provoke. And I mean, when I look at something like Zcash, what I really see is, and this is a misuse word these days, but is a platform, right? It's the firm foundation to build millions of other tools, right? Cash is not interesting because it is cash, right? Cash is interesting because of the incredible things that you can coordinate and create with what it represents. And so when I look at you know, the privacy protective features of Zcash and many of its other sort of characteristics, just like there's this Cambrian explosion of blockchain technologies, I look to, okay, what would you build on top of this, right? What would you create? What if you assume that this is just an API that exists everywhere, like everybody in the world having an HTML renderer, right? What does that mean? And I think it means a couple of things, right? First of all, it means that you have to build that with like a legal and, as I said, a legal and sort of intuition foundation that everyone understands. Otherwise, they're just going to get stuck at this level, or policymakers are going to create things that just stop that foundation from setting, right? And then I think you need flexibility and variety in that underlying tech, right? Like you need to try and make sure you're not shutting off opportunities by how you build it. And I think that I think that behooves like the people right now, and you are all cypherpunks here, you are all the first people building these foundations for the future, to make those to leave as much power in the hands of the people that will come after you as you created. So you build something and then you let it grow. And I know we're running out of time, but this is a really key point. The thing that coded speech protects is the ability for people to create software and express it, and have that expression separated legally from what people do with that technology afterwards. And that there are two parts to that conversation. And just because someone that you're talking to goes and does something, a bad thing, that does not mean that like you are the person who was bad for just talking to them or starting that conversation. And for the next few years, that is the thing I think we're going to spend a lot of time trying to protect. In the Napster days, there was this moment where the rights holders were going, we want to stop this thing. Who do we turn the law against? And most people remember they turned the laws against grandmothers and teenagers in colleges and so forth. But they also turned it against the creators of this software. They went after people who were just writing the code in the same way as they went after Phil Zimmerman for just thinking in this particular way. And you know what, like that's not right. And it's also a huge constraint on the future. So what we're going to spend a lot of time in the next few years doing, I think, is that people will try and go after a lot of these technologies by targeting the creators and the developers, and of course throwing technical blocks and what have you in the rest of the people's way. And you have to concentrate on stopping any bad things from happening while the concrete is setting in your foundations, because after that you have a new environment that you can work within, that enables you to solve the problems that perhaps this new vista creates, but most importantly kind of explore this new world that you've shown and brought to the world to share.
Dang, Danny, you ended on such a powerful note. The people are clamoring for a part 2, so please cancel all of your plans. Maybe we'll do something in the coming months. But I can't thank you enough for being our very first guest to kick off Zeal Calls for 2021. We will definitely be reaching out to you to see if you'd be willing to, or if any of your colleagues at EFF would be willing to come talk to us again. I think it would be fun to play with some Zcash platforms like Zec Pages and really kind of show coded speech and anonymous speech in action. But until then, I know that you made a lot of people happy today. This was a really, really engaging and enriching conversation.
Well, if you are happy, even if you are sad or angry, if you search for EFF.org Zcash, I think this will be the top hit now, because that's how search engines work. But you'll also see how you can donate to EFF and support us in the work we are to try and build this world with you together.
Exactly. Yes, we're building this world together. The Zcash community has been very generous. I think they donated combined like $30,000 last year to various charities. And specifically, I think the EFF transparent address has over $15,000, or has received over the course of its existence over $15,000. So yeah, we'll have to do this again, Danny. Let this be the first of several conversations. I know the Zcash community would love to have you back.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Oh, let's see if there were any last minute questions. There's one from an anonymous attendee. I don't think it applies to Danny, but how to handle Zcash inflation and the hindering price action of tokens? That is a question we will have to leave to the forum, but I know it's something that comes up all the time, and it's definitely part of the exciting like twists and turns that Zcash as a platform, like Danny talked about, and Zcash as an asset, like a lot of people know it, the many facets of how you can think about Zcash. So with that, I will stop sharing the screen and then kind of conclude this month's Zeal call. So thanks again, Danny. And for everyone who participated, thank you so much for joining the call.